In the quiet town of Pine Hollow, a war veteran thought he had lost all reason to keep going until the day he crossed paths with two frail German Shepherd pups. From the moment he looked into their amber eyes, something stirred, something he hadn't felt in years. What began as an act of rescue soon revealed a bond far deeper than loyalty or companionship. Through sleepless nights, sudden storms, and an unexpected call for help, these small heroes would change everything. But how far could their courage carry them? And him? The beginning of the story did not unfold on a quiet porch in Pine Hollow, or in the gentle light of an autumn flea market, but in a place far less kind, a place that smelled of damp straw, unwashed concrete, and the heavy odor of too many bodies pressed together in too little space. It was nothing more than a makeshift shelter, built from rusted tin sheets and rotting wooden planks, set on the edge of an abandoned farm lot, where a man who thought more about quick money than about care had gathered litters of puppies to sell. Inside that dim, cluttered space, the sound was constant, a chorus of whining, the scrape of claws against wooden boards, the muffled barking of larger dogs locked in cages nearby. The light that entered came in through cracks in the tin roof, pale and gray dust floating in the air like tired snowflakes that had lost their shine. In the far corner, where the drafts cut sharpest and the straw on the floor was thinnest, lay two German Shepherd puppies. They were hardly more than skin stretched over bone, their fur a dull mix of golden brown and black, though beneath the dirt and matted tangles, one could still glimpse the potential of coats that, in another life, would have gleamed like polished amber in the sun. The older one was Leo, a male pup with slightly broader shoulders and eyes that carried a flicker of restless fire, as though he had been born to charge ahead, even when he had no strength left to do so. Beside him, Mira, a smaller female with softer lines and quieter eyes, leaned into his body for warmth. Her gaze was steady but cautious, and where Leo lunged at the world with determination, she seemed to measure it carefully, as if weighing each choice before daring to move. That morning, like every morning, the man tossed a shallow bowl into the center of the room, to whom a few stale pieces of bread and scraps that could hardly be called food. The stronger puppies lunged first, growling and shoving to claim their share. Leo, though hungrier than he could bear, glanced at Mira first. His ribs showed clearly beneath his patchy fur, and yet when he bit into one crust, he nudged it forward with his nose, pushing it toward his sister. Mira hesitated, then took a small piece, chewed slowly, and slid the rest back toward him. The ritual repeated itself day after day, each of them giving up part of what little they had, each of them choosing to survive together rather than to fight alone. At night, when the cold settled into the boards and the wind slipped through the broken seams of the shelter, the two of them curled tightly against each other. Leo pressed his body around Mira like a shield, and Mira tucked her nose beneath his chin, their breaths forming tiny clouds that rose into the shadows. The sound of the other dogs faded into the background, and in those fragile hours, all they had was the warmth of one another. Weeks passed this way, marked not by calendars or clocks, but by the rhythm of survival. Eat if food appeared, endure when it did not, shiver together until the sun rose again. Leo's leg bore a faint scar where another pup had bitten him in a scramble for food, and Mira carried a tear at the edge of one ear. Yet neither complaint nor bitterness passed between them. Pain simply became part of the fabric of their lives, a thread woven beside hunger, fear, and the stubborn persistence of hope. Sometimes when the man opened the door to collect one or two puppies for sale, Leo and Mira pressed closer together, their bodies stiff with the fear that one would be taken and the other left behind. Each time fortune or perhaps fate spared them, though it meant that others vanished into the unknown, their whimpers fading with distance. The bond between the two deepened with every such moment, until it was clear that separation was not merely frightening, it was unthinkable. On one particular evening, rain hammered the tin roof so hard, the whole structure seemed to tremble. Water leaked through holes, dripping cold onto the floor, soaking the straw until it smelled of mildew. The other dogs cried louder that night, some from the chill, some from hunger. Leo stood shaking his small paws, slipping on the wet floor, and dragged the only dry patch of straw he could find toward Mira. She looked at him with those wide, steady eyes and lowered her head, sharing what little comfort they could build between them. In that dimness, the two puppies made a vow without words. Whatever came, they would face it side by side. The man who ran the shelter rarely looked at them closely. To him, they were inventory numbers in a litter creatures whose value was measured only by how quickly they could be sold. Yet even he noticed from time to time how these two never fought the way others did, how they seemed to move with an unspoken rhythm, one leading the other, following, then trading places. He would laugh bitterly, muttering about strange little mutts before slamming the door shut again. One dawn, when the pale light of a reluctant sun filtered through the holes in the roof, the man entered with a rope in one hand and irritation in his eyes. Business had been slow mouths to feed too many, and he had no patience left. He threw a few scraps on the ground, but even as the puppies rushed forward, he shook his head. Enough of this, he muttered, his boots crunching against the wet straw. He gathered them roughly, lifting Leo by the scruff, then Mira, and then the rest of the litter. They whimpered, confused paws dangling in the air as they were shoved into an old wooden crate that smelled of oil and rust. Leo pressed against Mira inside the dark box, his small heart pounding as the lid slammed shut, blocking out the faint light they had known. The crate jolted as it was lifted, carried outside into the gray morning where the air smelled of smoke and wet earth. For hours they were jostled along roads that rattled their tiny bones until at last the crate was set down again. When the lid creaked open, new sounds met their ears, the murmur of human voices, the clatter of tables being set up, the shuffle of boots across gravel. The smell of roasting peanuts mingled with gasoline fumes, the unmistakable scent of a market waking to life. The man hauled the crate toward a post near the far edge of the flea market, tied a frayed rope around the puppies' small necks, and tethered them to a splintered fence. Around them rose rows of mismatched stalls, selling rusted tools, dented oil cans, and stacks of faded books. People drifted past without more than a glance at the thin, trembling bodies of the puppies. The man spat into the dirt, muttering, $10 apiece, take it or leave it, as though the lives at the end of the rope were no more meaningful than the broken farm tools beside them. Leo sat down heavily, his ribs rising and falling with tired breaths, but his eyes still bright beneath the exhaustion, fixed on the crowd. Mira lowered herself beside him, leaning lightly against his shoulder, and together they watched the legs of strangers pass by. Their fate now hung by a thread. And though they could not know it, this day would mark the end of their time in that dark shelter. And the beginning of a story no one at that flea market could have imagined. The sun pushed weakly through the autumn clouds, lighting the dust that swirled in the air. Somewhere among the stalls, footsteps approached, slow and deliberate, carrying with them the sound of a man who did not yet know that his life was about to change forever. And there, at the far edge of the market, the two puppies waited, thin, shivering, bound together, by hunger, by loyalty, and by the silent promise they had made, in the cold nights of the shelter, to face the world side by side. The flea market in Pine Hollow had always been a peculiar blend of nostalgia and neglect. A place where cracked porcelain cups were stacked beside rusted tractor parts, where the air carried the scent of fried dough mingled with gasoline from old lawnmowers that had not run in decades. It was held every Saturday along the cracked pavement of Main Street, a tradition so rooted in the town's rhythm that people came less for bargains than for the chance to drift slowly among familiar voices. That particular Saturday morning carried the crisp edge of autumn. The trees that lined the street had shed half their leaves, scattering gold and crimson across the ground so thick that each step released a faint crunch. Smoke curled from chimneys in the nearby houses, and the air smelled of wood fires and damp earth. It was the kind of morning that seemed to invite ordinary routines. Neighbors greeting each other with small talk, children tugging at parents' hands for a taste of kettle corn vendors, hawking everything from tools to quilts stitched with patterns passed down through generations. Into this scene walked David Miller. At 44, he moved with a deliberate caution, his tall frame slightly bent as though weighed down by an invisible pack. His hair was dark, but threaded with gray, his skin weathered by foreign suns that still seemed to burn in memory. A limp marked his gait, the legacy of a blast he had survived years ago. And though his jacket was simple canvas, the way he wore it spoke of a man who had learned to treat every pocket, every fold as functional rather than decorative. His eyes, steel blue once, now muted by shadows, scanned the market the way a soldier scans unfamiliar ground, careful, precise, and never fully at ease. David had not come searching for companionship or sentiment that morning. He had come looking for a wrench. The railing on his porch had come loose, and the last thing he wanted was to fall on the uneven steps of the farmhouse he lived in alone. The flea market, with its endless clutter, often yielded treasures among the junk. But as he walked between tables stacked with chipped mugs and boxes of tangled extension cords, his mind drifted, as it often did, to the war-torn landscapes of Afghanistan and Iraq, places where dust and fear had etched themselves into his skin. It was by chance, or perhaps by something less random, that his gaze fell to the far edge of the market. There, near a stall piled high with dented oil cans and broken saw blades, stood a frayed rope tied loosely to a fence post. At the end of it were 2 German shepherd puppies. They were painfully thin ribs, visible beneath patchy coats of golden brown and black. The kind of fur that should have gleamed in the sun, but now hung dull with neglect. One pup, slightly larger, sat upright, though unsteady, his amber eyes fixed on the flow of people with a steady intensity. The smaller one leaned against him, head low, ears twitching at each passing step, body pressed close as though seeking reassurance. They did not whimper or tug at the rope. They simply sat silent and still, like 2 children abandoned in a crowd. Something in David's chest tightened. He had seen those eyes before, not these puppies exactly, but the look they carried. It was the look he had once seen reflected in a mirror after returning home from the desert, weary, unflinching, resigned to endure whatever came next. It was the gaze of the battle-worn, too young to understand why life had stripped them down, too stubborn to give up. Beside them stood their seller, a heavy-set man in a stained plaid jacket. His beard was coarse, his hands stuffed deep in his pockets, as though he could not be bothered even to hold the rope. When he noticed David pausing, he tilted his head with a grunt. "You looking?" the man asked, his voice gravelly, carrying the slow drawl of someone who had never left these hills. David stepped closer, his boots crunching against grit. He nodded toward the puppies. "What's their story?" The man shrugged, eyes already drifting elsewhere. "Ain't no story. Couple of mouths to feed. Can't afford it. They don't fetch much. You want 'em $10. Otherwise I'll haul 'em to the shelter Monday." The words landed heavy. David knew what shelters meant for unwanted animals in small towns, short stays, and quick endings. He looked at the puppies again. Neither cowered nor barked. They simply waited, eyes fixed on him with that silent plea that was not quite begging, not quite surrender. In the distance, voices drifted from the coffee stall. Laughter rose from a group of teenagers. The ordinary world continued. But for David, time narrowed until it was only the rope, the 2 fragile bodies, and the echo of his own hollow loneliness. He remembered the long nights when his porch creaked under his weight as he sat staring into darkness, the silence in his house so thick it pressed against his ears. He remembered the feeling of being left behind, discarded, after years of service, told to build a new life, when his old one had never truly ended. And now, here were these 2 discarded too. Without fully realizing it, David reached into his jacket pocket. His fingers found the crumpled $10 bill he had brought for the wrench. He unfolded it, smoothing it with his thumb, and held it out. "I'll take them." The man snatched the bill without ceremony, muttering, "Your problem now," before turning back to haggle with another customer. David crouched slowly, careful not to startle the puppies. "Hey," he said softly, his voice lowering to a gentleness he rarely used. He loosened the knot around the fence post, letting the frayed rope slip free. The larger pup, Leo, though David did not yet know the name, shifted forward first, unsteady but determined. Mira followed her small body, pressing close to his leg, as if she had already chosen him. For a moment, man and puppy stood together amid the bustle of the market. The sun caught the amber in their eyes, and David felt a flicker of recognition, a sense that this meeting was less chance than it was something waiting to happen. He held the rope loosely, yet neither pup pulled against it. Their small steps matched his pace as though they had been walking together for years. On the way out, he passed Mrs. Green, who ran the coffee stall, and was as much Pine Hollow's unofficial mayor as anyone could be. Tall and wiry, in her late 50s, with sharp eyes softened by kindness, she spotted him immediately. "Morning, David," she called. Her gaze dropped to the two pups at his side. "And who are these little souls?" David hesitated, then said, "Haven't named them yet." Mrs. Green frowned at their thin frames, the way Mira limped slightly as she walked. "Looks like they've had a rough go," she said gently. Then she crouched, extending a hand. Mira sniffed cautiously, then allowed her head to be scratched, her eyes closing briefly in something like relief. "Well," Mrs. Green murmured, "you're in good hands now." David nodded, uncomfortable under her warmth, but grateful nonetheless. He tugged the rope lightly and continued toward his truck. When he opened the door, Leo hopped in first, surprising him with agility despite his weakness. Mira scrambled after settling beside her brother on the seat as though it were already theirs. The drive home was quiet. The hum of the engine and the soft rattle of tools in the back filled the air. David glanced over once or twice, half expecting restlessness, but the puppies simply sat gazing out the window at the trees that blurred past. In their stillness, he felt the first fragile threads of something he had not known he was missing: companionship. As the truck rolled out of town, leaving behind the noise of the market, David exhaled slowly. The wrench could wait. For the first time in a long while, his hands did not feel empty. He looked at the two pups, their eyes reflecting the fading light, and whispered almost to himself, "We'll figure this out together." The road stretched ahead, curving toward the farmhouse that had always felt too silent. But today, the silence would be broken by the sound of small paws, by the rustle of straw shifting as two fragile lives began to settle into a new home. And though David could not yet know it, the choice he had made with a crumpled bill would grow into something far larger. Something that would change not only their futures, but his own. For now, though, it was enough that 3 wounded souls, 1 man, 2 puppies, were no longer alone. The gravel road to David Miller's farmhouse wound through the rolling hills of Pine Hollow, curving past fields gone fallow and patches of maple and oak already stripped bare by October winds. His truck rattled over potholes, carrying its unusual cargo, 2 German shepherd pups huddled close together on the passenger seat. Mira's small frame pressed against her brother, as though bracing herself against each bump, while Leo sat, taller ears pricked, trying to take in every passing blur of color. David stole a glance at them now and then, his weathered hands steady on the wheel. The farmhouse was not much to look at, a structure of gray wood that had stood for nearly a century perched on land that bore the weight of generations. Since his return from war, the house had been more shell than home, a place to sleep, patchwork repairs holding it together, silence filling every crevice. It seemed almost absurd to think of bringing 2 fragile lives into such solitude. Yet as the truck climbed the last hill and the roof came into view, David felt for the first time in years the faint tug of anticipation. He parked in front of the porch, the boards creaking under his boots as he stepped down. The autumn air was sharper here, carrying the smell of pine and damp soil. He opened the passenger door and Leo bounded out first, tumbling onto the gravel with clumsy enthusiasm. His paws slipped, but he righted himself quickly, tail wagging furiously, amber eyes scanning every direction. Mira hesitated. She crouched low on the seat watching her brother, then the open space, her ears tilted back. David extended his hand. "It's all right," he murmured. After a moment, Mira slid cautiously from the seat, her paws landing lightly on the gravel. She stuck close to David's leg, nose twitching as she sniffed the air, her movements deliberate. Leo, meanwhile, had already discovered the porch steps and was scrambling upward, his nails clattering against the wood. The front door opened with a groan when David pushed its hinges, complaining after years of neglect. The interior was dim shadows stretched across the wooden floor where sunlight leaked through warped blinds. The house smelled of old timber dust and faint traces of the wood stove that had not been lit in weeks. Leo charged in first, his small body darting across the living room, sniffing chair legs and pressing his nose against every corner as if declaring the territory his own. Mira lingered at the threshold, her head-lowered eyes scanning the unfamiliar space. She took one step, then another, pausing between each as though the floor itself might shift beneath her. David closed the door gently behind them. For a moment he simply stood there, watching the contrast between them, the boldness of Leo, the wariness of Mira. He recognized both instincts, the urge to rush into the unknown and the urge to keep back. They were in their way, reflections of himself. The living room was sparse, an old sofa draped with a wool blanket, a coffee table scarred with cigarette burns from decades past, and a rocking chair positioned in a position near the stove. David knelt by the corner, unrolling an old quilt he had pulled from storage. He laid it across the floor, shaking off the dust. The pups watched Mira from a cautious distance, Leo with a head tilt of curiosity. "Not much," David said quietly, almost to himself. "But it's yours now, too." From the kitchen, he retrieved a pair of mismatched bowls. He rinsed them quickly in the sink, the cold water rattling in the pipes, then filled one with water from the tap, the other with leftover chicken and rice he had cooked the night before. The smell filled the small house, drawing Leo immediately. He rushed over, tail wagging, nearly knocking the bowl in his eagerness. Mira followed slower each step, cautious, her nose twitching as the scent pulled her forward. David set the bowls on the floor and stepped back, watching. Leo plunged his muzzle into the food without hesitation, devouring mouthfuls with noisy gulps. Mira paused beside him, leaning in but withdrawing quickly each time, glancing toward her brother. Then, in a gesture so instinctive, it seemed practiced, Leo pulled back after a few bites, lifting his head and nudging the bowl toward her with his nose. Mira blinked, then lowered her head, taking slow, delicate bites while Leo sat back panting happily, as if guarding her. When she had eaten enough, she nudged the bowl back, and Leo returned to finish the rest. David felt something stir inside him at the sight. It was more than survival. It was trust, the kind forged in hardship. These pups carried it like a language, one he had nearly forgotten. After eating, Leo bounded off to explore further. He darted down the hallway, paws tapping against the wooden floor, then burst into the bedroom, nosing under the bed and emerging with a dust bunny stuck to his muzzle. Mira followed at a slower pace, keeping close to the walls, her body tense each time the floorboards creaked. In the kitchen, she paused by the back door, staring out through the glass at the wide expanse of field beyond. For a long moment, she stood still, ears flicking, then pressed her nose lightly to the glass, as if testing the barrier between confinement and open air. Leo barked once, high-pitched and eager, startling her. He darted back into the living room, skidding across the floor before plopping down on the quilt with a satisfied huff. Mira eventually joined him, curling beside her brother with a sigh. David watched them, a small smile ghosting across his face. The farmhouse, long a place of silence, seemed altered already. corners no longer felt so empty. That evening, David stoked the old wood stove, its iron belly groaning as flames licked the logs. The warmth spread slowly, filling the house with the crackle of fire. He spread another blanket on the floor, folding it into a nest beside the quilt. From a shelf, he retrieved an old pillow, placing it down as well. The pups observed his work with interest. Leo tested each new object, immediately pawing at the blanket circling before flopping onto it as though he had discovered treasure. Mira sniffed carefully before settling near him. Her body curled tight, but her eyes half closed, comfort slowly seeping in. David sat in the rocking chair watching the fire and the small shapes curled on the floor. The light flickered across their fur, highlighting the rise and fall of their breathing. His own chest rose and fell with theirs, the rhythm soothing in a way he had not known he craved. He poured himself coffee, the bitter taste grounding him. Outside, the wind rattled the windows. Inside, for once, there was warmth that did not feel empty. As night deepened, the house settled into quiet. Leo stirred occasionally, lifting his head to check on the room before tucking it back against Mira's side. Mira, half asleep, shifted once to press closer to him, her small body finding comfort in contact. David stood, his knees stiff, and spread another blanket gently over them. They did not wake, only shifted slightly, Leo's paw draping protectively over Mira's back. For a long time, David remained standing there, listening to their breathing mingle with the crackle of the stove. He thought of battlefields where sleep had come only in snatches broken by explosions or shouts. He thought of the silence that had followed him home, the silence that had never felt like peace. Tonight the silence was different. It was alive, filled with presence. He knelt once more, resting his hand lightly on Leo's head, then Mira's. Their fur was soft despite its roughness, warmth seeping into his palm. His voice, low and steady, carried words that surprised even him. "From now on," he whispered, "you are safe." The fire crackled. Outside, the wind sighed through the trees. And within the old farmhouse, for the first time in years, safety felt possible. Morning light filtered through the warped blinds of David Miller's farmhouse, painting slanted lines across the wooden floor. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of pine through the cracks in the old window frames. David rose early out of habit rather than necessity, his joints stiff from years of service and the cold that lingered in his bones. When he shuffled into the living room, he found Leo already awake. The pup sat squarely on the quilt near the wood stove, ears pricked, posture attentive, as though he had been waiting for orders. Mira lay curled beside him, half drowsy, but alert enough that her eyes flicked open the moment David stepped forward. There was something about their gaze that caught him. They didn't look at him with the vacant innocence of animals that knew nothing of hardship. Their eyes carried weight, awareness. David poured water into the kettle and set it on the stove. The familiar scrape of metal on iron seemed to stir Leo into action. The pup bounced forward, tail wagging furiously, pawing at David's boot. "What are you after?" David muttered, though a small smile tugged at his lips. He crouched and raised his hand instinctively, palm open. Leo froze, tilting his head. His ears twitched, his gaze fixed on David's hand. On a hunch, David lowered his palm slowly toward the floor, murmuring, "Sit." For a second, nothing happened. Then, with the clumsy eagerness of one testing something new, Leo dropped his haunches to the floor. His tail swept dust from the boards as he looked up expectantly. David blinked. Well, I'll be damned. He hadn't trained a dog in years, not since his childhood farm days, long before deployments and desert heat. Yet this small creature had grasped the meaning of his motion and word almost instantly. To be sure, David repeated it. Again, Leo obeyed, quicker this time, as if proud of himself. Mira, from her spot by the stove, lifted her head. She didn't mimic the command. Instead, she simply watched, her eyes following every detail David's gesture. Leo's reaction, the quiet satisfaction in the man's expression. She was cataloging, measuring, storing it away. David noticed. "You're the quiet one, huh?" he said softly. Mira lowered her gaze, but her ears twitched. Throughout the morning, David moved through chores. He chopped kindling by the shed, repaired a loose shutter, and checked the sagging fence along the back field. Leo bounded at his heels, chasing falling wood chips, tangling himself in loose rope, yapping at every crow that dared land on the fence posts. Mira, by contrast, remained near the porch. She sat still, watching, always watching. Her eyes never strayed far from David or her brother. When Leo tumbled headfirst into a pile of leaves, Mira's ears flicked, her body tensing until he popped out again. When David paused mid-chop to stretch his back, Mira's gaze fixed on him, measuring his movements as though ensuring he wasn't hurt. David felt the scrutiny. At first it unnerved him, being studied so carefully by a creature barely 12 weeks old. Yet as the hours passed, the sensation shifted into something else, strange comfort. Someone was keeping guard. That afternoon, clouds rolled heavy across the hills. The air smelled of impending rain. David sat on the porch steps with a mug of coffee, the pups sprawled nearby. Leo gnawed a stick with noisy determination, while Mira rested beside him, chin on her paws. The silence shattered with a sharp crack. A tree branch swollen with moisture had snapped and fallen in the woods behind the barn. David flinched, his body reacting before his mind caught up, muscles coiled as though expecting gunfire. The mug nearly slipped from his hand. His breath hitched, an old reflex he had thought dulled with time. Before he could steady himself, both pups leapt into action. Leo sprang upright, hackles raised, a growl bubbling in his tiny throat. Mira shot to her feet, standing shoulder to shoulder with her brother. But while Leo barked furiously toward the trees, Mira stayed silent. Eyes narrowed, body stiff as a drawn bow. She wasn't just startled, she was guarding. David's heart hammered. He stared at them, a strange mixture of awe and recognition flooding him. They had seen his reaction, felt the shift in his body, and responded not with confusion, but with solidarity. They had his back. The woods quieted again, only the whisper of leaves in the wind. Leo's barks softened to grumbles, and Mira's stance eased, though she remained upright, eyes scanning the distance. David exhaled slowly, setting his mug down with careful hands. "You two?" His voice cracked. He cleared his throat. "You're not just pups, are you?" Leo turned to him with his goofy, eager face, tongue lolling. Mira stayed fixed on the tree line, as if unwilling to relax until she was sure the threat had passed. That night, David built a small stew on the stove, the scent of carrots and potatoes filling the house. He divided a portion into 2 bowls and set them on the floor. As always, Leo dove in first, Mira hanging back. But the pattern repeated after a few bites. Leo lifted his head and nudged the bowl toward his sister. Mira leaned in, eating delicately, while Leo waited. Only when she finished did he return to clean the dish. David sat at the tablespoon in his own bowl, paused halfway. He thought of foxholes and ration packs of men sharing scraps under desert skies. He thought of loyalty forged not from orders, but from necessity. "You're a pair of soldiers," he murmured. The pups didn't hear the weight in his tone, but they carried it anyway. The following morning, David decided to test Leo's newfound talent. Out on the porch, he stood with a small piece of bread in hand. "Sit," he commanded, hand lowering. Leo plopped down immediately, tail sweeping. David's lips twitched. "Stay." He stepped back. Leo wiggled but held position, eyes locked on the bread. Mira stood nearby, watching both of them. After a long pause, David said, "All right." Leo surged forward, grabbing the bread in his teeth with a triumphant yip. Mira flicked her ears, unimpressed, but the glint in her eyes betrayed something else, understanding. Over the next hour, David tried again and again. Leo learned with startling speed, sitting, staying, even lying down when David gestured. Mira never imitated, but her gaze never wavered. It was as though she was content to let her brother perform, while she absorbed silently, a tactician behind the lines. Toward evening, as rain began to patter against the roof, a rustling sound came from the barn. David frowned. He hadn't kept livestock in years, but the structure was old, prone to harboring raccoons or stray cats. He opened the back door, stepping into the damp air. Before he could move further, both pups darted past him, ears forward, bodies tense. Leo barked sharply, charging ahead while Mira trotted close at his side, silent but fierce. They reached the barn before David. Inside, a raccoon scrambled up the rafters, knocking loose straw to the floor. Leo growled, barking with fury, while Mira stood below, eyes locked upward, body positioned squarely between the creature and David. David felt his throat tighten. It wasn't about the raccoon, harmless enough if left alone. It was about what they had done without hesitation. They had positioned themselves as his shield. "Easy," he said softly, placing a hand on Leo's back. The pup stiffened, but quieted at his touch. Mira glanced back once, as if checking his reaction, then returned her gaze to the rafters until the raccoon scuttled away. Only then did she relax, pressing lightly against his leg. That night the fire burned low. The pups lay together on the quilt, their bodies curled, their breathing steady. David sat in the rocking chair, staring at them through the flickering light. He thought of comrades lost overseas, men who had watched his back and whom he had guarded in turn. He thought of the loneliness since his return, of the hollow quiet of this farmhouse. And now these two. Creatures so small, yet carrying in them the instincts of loyalty, the spark of intelligence that could grow into something greater. Leo reckless and eager. Mira silent and steady. Two halves of something he hadn't realized he needed. For the first time, David let himself lean back fully in the chair, his chest loosening. "You're not just animals," he whispered into the crackle of fire. "You're anchors." Neither stirred, but Mira's ear flicked once, as though the words had landed. Rain drummed steadily against the roof, a lullaby for the weary house. David stood pulling the blanket higher around the pups. He lingered, his hand brushing across Mira's back, then Leo's. In their warmth, in their steady breaths, he felt something shift inside him. A first signal not just of their intelligence, but of a bond taking root. They were no longer strays rescued by chance. They were becoming something else entirely. His voice was low but firm, carrying the weight of a vow. "We've got each other now." The farmhouse, once hollow, now held 3 lives bound together. And in that fragile, unspoken promise, David realized he had begun to breathe again. The rain had passed during the night, leaving the world damp and bright. Pine Hollow always smelled sweeter after a storm, as though the forest had rinsed itself clean. The sun pierced through scattered clouds, dappling the muddy path that wound from David Miller's porch toward the main road. He stood there in the morning chill, a steaming mug in hand, listening to the distant calls of crows. At his feet, Leo nosed a puddle, pawing at his rippling reflection with clumsy delight. Mira stayed close to the porch, ever watchful, her gaze shifting between her brother's antics and the tree line beyond. It was in that moment, as David breathed in the cool air, that he heard the crunch of wheels on gravel. He stiffened instinctively, old habits flaring. Visitors were rare out here. When the sound grew louder, accompanied by the faint hum of an engine, David realized with a mixture of relief and mild unease who it must be: Mrs. Green. Her old station wagon rolled into view, a pale blue relic that had survived more years than seemed possible. It rattled as she parked beside his sagging fence. The door creaked open, and out stepped Mrs. Evelyn Greenshaw, wrapped tight around her shoulders, her silver hair tucked beneath a scarf. In her arms, she carried a basket covered with a checkered cloth. "Morning, David," she called cheerfully, though her voice carried the faint tremor of age. David raised his hand in a polite wave. "Morning, Mrs. Green." His voice was gruff, but not unfriendly. She approached the porch with steady steps, her shoes squelching lightly in the damp earth. As she drew near, Leo bounded forward, tail whipping like a metronome, barking in short bursts of excitement. Mira, however, froze at the top step. Her ears tilted back, her body tense, as though the appearance of a stranger disrupted the fragile world she had only just begun to trust. "Well now," Mrs. Green said, pausing as Leo danced circles around her. "Aren't you a lively one?" She crouched carefully, balancing the basket, and reached out a hand. Leo responded with enthusiasm, leaping up to lick her fingers. Mira growled softly low in her throat. David stepped closer. "Easy, girl," he murmured, resting a hand on her head. Mira's body trembled beneath his touch, but she stayed put, eyes locked on the unfamiliar figure. Mrs. Green straightened, smiling warmly. "I thought you could use a little something. You never come into town much, and after that storm last night, I worried you might have lost power again." She set the basket on the porch table and lifted the cloth. Inside were mason jars of stew, a loaf of crusty bread wrapped in wax paper, and even a small tin of cookies. The smell drifted up rich and comforting, filling the air with a homely warmth. David cleared his throat. "You didn't have to do that." "Nonsense," Mrs. Green replied briskly. "It's what neighbors do." Her gaze softened as it shifted to the pups. "And besides, I had a feeling you might need a little extra with these two mouths to feed." Leo barked as though in agreement, tail wagging furiously. Mira, however, remained pressed against David's leg, her wary eyes flicking between the basket and the woman, Mrs. Green lowered herself into the porch chair, moving with deliberate slowness, as though careful not to startle Mira. She patted her lap lightly. "It's all right, sweetheart," she cooed. "I won't hurt you." Mira's ears twitched at the tone. Still, she didn't move forward. Leo, unconcerned, stuck his nose boldly into the basket, trying to steal a piece of bread. David scooped him up by the scruff, with practiced ease, muttering, "Not yours?" Mrs. Green chuckled. "Full of spirit, that one. But the other—" Her eyes lingered on Mira. "She's the cautious soul." David nodded. "She doesn't take to strangers easy. She's smart," Mrs. Green corrected gently. "Sometimes the smart ones just need more time." For several minutes, the porch settled into a quiet rhythm. The birds called from the wet trees, the kettle hissed faintly in the kitchen, and Mrs. Green spoke in a soft stream about the town. The bakery reopening after repairs, the school children rehearsing for their spring play, the new paint on the church steeple. David listened, nodding occasionally, though his focus kept drifting to Mira. The pup's body had relaxed slightly, though her paws stayed rooted. Her eyes never left Mrs. Green's hands, and then, almost imperceptibly, Mira inched forward. It was cautious, halting progress, one paw a pause, another paw. Her head dipped low, ears tilted back, tail tucked. She looked not unlike a soldier crossing exposed ground, wary of ambush. Mrs. Green remained perfectly still, hand extended, palm up. She didn't coax or clap, she simply waited. Finally, Mira's nose touched her fingertips. She flinched at the contact, then lingered sniffing. Mrs. Green's face softened into a smile. "There now," she whispered. "See, I'm just an old woman with too many cookies in her kitchen." Mira stood frozen a moment longer before leaning in just enough to allow a gentle stroke along her head. It was tentative, a brush of hand over soft fur. But it was enough to draw a lump into David's throat. For Mira, the moment marked a fragile breakthrough. She didn't transform into a lapdog overnight, but when Mrs. Green withdrew her hand, Mira didn't retreat. Instead, she settled near the porch table, close enough to watch, but no longer pressed into David's leg. She trusts you, Mrs. Green said softly, catching David's eye. David shook his head. She tolerates, that's all. But the warmth in his chest betrayed him. He had seen enough in life to know when a wall had cracked, even if only slightly. Mrs. Green unfolded the bread and handed David a slice. Feed them well, and you'll see. They'll give back more than you can imagine. As the morning stretched, conversation drifted. At first, David responded with his usual brevity, yes, no, maybe, but Mrs. Green had a way of filling silences without smothering them. She spoke of her garden of canning peaches last summer, of her late husband's habit of leaving boots by the door. David found himself replying in longer sentences, almost before he realized it. He mentioned the storm shutters that needed mending, the raccoon that had taken up temporary residence in his barn. The fact that Leo seemed to think every stick in the yard belonged to him alone. Mrs. Green laughed a bright sound that startled him with its familiarity. It had been months, years even, since he had laughed along with someone. You know, she said at last, rising from her chair, you're easier to talk to when you've got company. She nodded at the pups now curled side by side at the edge of the porch. They're good for you, David. He didn't answer immediately, but his gaze lingered on Mira, who had finally let her chin rest on her paws, her body no longer tense. He thought of the quiet moment when she had accepted that first touch. Something inside him shifted, a reminder that trust could grow again, however slowly. Mrs. Green gathered her shawl and lifted her empty basket. Leo whined, pawing at her skirt, as if unwilling to see her leave. Mira lifted her head, but did not growl. She simply watched, eyes steady, as though measuring the departure as carefully as she had measured the arrival. Thank you for the food, David said, his voice gruff but sincere. She smiled, her eyes crinkling. Don't be a stranger, David. Doors stay open longer when neighbors use them. He walked her to the car, the pups trotting alongside. As the station wagon rumbled away, David stood at the edge of the road, hands shoved deep in his pockets, watching until the dust settled. Back inside, the farmhouse felt different. The air still smelled of stew and bread, but beneath that was another scent, something intangible. David glanced at the pups. Leo had already sprawled across the rug, fast asleep, his belly round from scraps of bread he had managed to steal. Mira sat quietly by the door, her amber eyes thoughtful. When David knelt and rubbed her head, she leaned into his hand just enough to surprise him. For the first time in years, he spoke aloud, without rehearsing the words. Maybe I can learn to do this again, he murmured. Talk, trust, live. Mira blinked slowly, as if in agreement. That night, as the farmhouse settled into silence, David realized something had changed. The dogs had not only opened his home, but nudged open his world, through the tentative trust of one cautious pup and the persistence of a caring neighbor. The walls around his heart had begun to thin. And as he extinguished the lamp, he whispered into the dark, not to the empty house, but to the two pairs of ears listening nearby. We're not alone anymore. The morning began earlier than usual. A pale frost clung to the grass outside the farmhouse, each blade glittering in the sunrise like a shard of glass. David Miller tightened the collar of his jacket as he loaded the old truck, its engine coughing awake in the chill. Leo bounded around the yard, eager for adventure, tail swinging like a pendulum. Mira, ever cautious, lingered closer to the porch, her amber eyes studying the strange preparation. Come on, girl, David coaxed, patting the passenger seat. It's just a ride. Nothing to worry about. Mira hesitated, glancing from David to her brother. Leo had already leapt onto the seat tongue, lolling happily as though the truck was the greatest playground in the world. After a moment, Mira placed her front paws on the step and pulled herself up, curling tightly against Leo for reassurance. David closed the door gently. His breath fogged in the cold air. Today was important. The pups had been with him for several weeks now, their ribs less visible, their coats glossier, their energy brimming. But the shadows of their past still clung Leo's occasional limp after long play. Mira's wariness at sudden movements, the faint scars that crisscrossed beneath their fur. He needed to know how deep those scars went and whether time, food, and care would be enough. He steered the truck onto the road toward Pine Hollow's only veterinary clinic. The clinic sat on the edge of town, a modest brick building with a green-painted sign, Cole Veterinary Care. A line of bare maple trees framed the parking lot, their branches scratching the sky. David pulled into a space, cut the engine, and turned to the pups. Leo's nose was already pressed to the window, fogging the glass with excited breaths. Mira stayed low, pressed against the seat, her ears twitching nervously. "Easy now," David murmured, slipping the leashes over their collars. "We're just here to make sure you're all right." The door creaked open, and the world flooded with smells, sterile, disinfectant, wet. Earth, faint traces of other animals. Leo leapt down, eagerly, nearly tangling his leash in his paws. Mira descended slowly, her body taut eyes scanning every movement around them. Inside the waiting room was warm with posters of smiling dogs and cats taped to the walls. A friendly bell chimed as the door shut behind them. At the reception desk stood Emily, the veterinary nurse. She was in her 20s, her auburn hair tied back, her smile bright and genuine. "Well, look at you two," she said, kneeling slightly to greet the pups. "Aren't you handsome and beautiful?" Leo responded with enthusiastic licks, tugging at his leash to reach her hand. Mira, however, shrank back against David's leg. Emily softened her voice. "It's all right, sweetheart. You're safe here." She glanced up at David. "First visit?" He nodded. "Yeah, picked them up not long ago. Thought it was time they got checked." "You did the right thing," Emily assured him. She clipped tags onto their charts. "Dr. Cole will see you in a minute. You can wait over there." David led the pups to a bench. Leo sniffed every corner, trying to greet a cat in a carrier across the room, until David gently pulled him back. Mira tucked herself under the bench, pressed so close that David could feel the warmth of her body against his boots. A door opened, and a tall man in his 50s stepped through. Dr. Cole wore a crisp white coat, his graying hair swept back neatly. His eyes, however, carried the calm kindness of someone who had spent decades easing pain. "Mr. Miller," he said. "That's me. Come on in. Let's meet your companions." The examination room smelled faintly of antiseptic and lavender. A steel table gleamed under bright lights. Mira froze at the threshold, planting her paws firmly against the floor. David crouched beside her. "It's all right, girl. Just a quick check. I'm here." He lifted her gently, carrying her to the table, while Leo scrambled up with Emily's help, eager to see everything. Dr. Cole adjusted his glasses, running practiced hands over Leo first. He checked teeth, ears, and paws, his movements efficient yet gentle. Leo wagged his tail the entire time, as though the doctor's cold stethoscope was just another form of play. "He's spirited," Cole said with a small smile. Then he paused, frowning slightly as he pressed along the pup's ribs. "You've been feeding him well lately, but I can feel where he was undernourished. His growth lines show he missed meals during his first months." David's jaw tightened. "Figures. They weren't treated well before." Cole nodded, moving to examine a faint scar along Leo's flank. Old wound. Healed on its own, likely untreated. He's lucky it didn't get infected. David stroked Leo's ears as the pup licked his hand. Lucky he made it at all. Then it was Mira's turn. She trembled visibly as Emily tried to coax her closer. David lifted her again, his hand steady on her back, whispering reassurance. Cole's touch was as gentle as before, but Mira flinched at every motion. Her ribs showed more sharply beneath her coat than Leo's, though the weight she had gained was noticeable. She's tougher, Cole murmured, listening through the stethoscope. Heart strong. But see these faint lines on her hind legs, old cuts, possibly wire or chain. Healed but still tender. And this shoulder feels like it healed from a sprain. She must have carried herself carefully for weeks. Emily's brow furrowed. Poor thing. Cole looked up at David. They've both endured more than most pups should. Malnourished, injured, abandoned. And yet, he stepped back, folding his arms. They're alive. Not just alive, but alert, intelligent, bonded. That speaks volumes. David's throat tightened as he looked at Mira, who pressed her head against his chest as if seeking shelter. He thought of the nights she had curled against Leo in the drafty shelter, both surviving on scraps and willpower. He thought of her wary courage, the way she always stood between danger and her brother. They survived, David said quietly. Cole's gaze was steady. They did more than survive. They endured with resilience. That's rare. These pups are remarkable. The room fell into a thoughtful silence. David ran his fingers through Mira's fur, feeling the tiny ridges of scars beneath the softness. Leo nudged his arm, demanding attention, oblivious to the solemnity. Cole began noting details on a chart. With proper nutrition, rest, and care, they'll recover well. The scars will fade. Some of the wariness may linger, especially in the female, but given time, love, and training, they'll flourish. Emily smiled, stroking Leo's head. They already seem devoted to you. That's half the battle won. David swallowed. He hadn't expected the checkup to stir so much inside him. But hearing those words, resilient, remarkable, brought a strange pride he couldn't quite explain. He had thought he was saving them. In truth, they carried a strength that humbled him. The rest of the appointment moved on vaccinations notes about diet suggestions for supplements. Leo yelped at the needle, but quickly forgave with a lick to Emily's hand. Mira shivered, but endured silently, her gaze fixed on David, as though drawing strength from his presence. Cole handed him a packet of instructions. Keep them on balanced meals, fresh water always available, and bring them back for boosters in a month. They'll need exercise too, but something tells me you already have plenty of space for that. David nodded. Plenty of woods around the house. Good, let them run, let them be dogs, but never forget they're survivors. That makes them both more vulnerable and stronger than most. The truck rattled back onto the road. Leo sprawled happily across the seat, already dozing, exhausted by the new adventure. Mira pressed herself against David's side, her body warm and trembling less than before. He drove in silence for a long time, the doctor's words echoing in his head. They endured with resilience. His hands tightened on the wheel. He had seen men broken by less soldiers, crushed under burdens, invisible and visible. But these two small creatures had clawed their way through neglect and hunger, and still they wagged their tails. Still they trusted enough to curl at his feet. David glanced down at Mira, who lifted her amber eyes to meet his. There was no self-pity in them, only watchfulness and something he almost dared to call hope. You're stronger than me, he murmured. Both of you. The words surprised him. He hadn't intended to speak them aloud, but in saying them he felt a strange release, an acknowledgement that strength wasn't always found in the battlefield or the weight of medals. Sometimes it was in survival, quiet and stubborn against the odds. The farmhouse welcomed them with familiar creaks. David set out fresh water and food watching as Leo dove in with gusto. As always, Mira nudged her portion toward her brother, letting him eat first before she took her share. The habit broke his heart, even as it filled him with admiration. Even in abundance, her instinct was to give. He crouched beside them, stroking both heads, his voice low. You don't have to fight anymore. You don't have to give up your share. But Maybe that's who you are. Survivors. Givers. The pups looked up at him, tails thumping softly against the floor. David felt the farmhouse less empty than ever before. It wasn't just his refuge anymore. It was a place of healing for them, and perhaps for him too. That night, as the fire crackled in the stove, David sat in his worn chair, Leo curled across his feet. Mira stretched along the rug nearby. He thought of Dr. Cole's words once more, remarkable resilient. He realized then that he hadn't just saved them from the market stall, hadn't just given them food and shelter. They had saved themselves long before, with courage he could only respect. And in their survival, they had offered him something too, a mirror of his own scars, and a reminder that even broken things could endure. He leaned forward, whispering to the sleeping pups, his voice carrying the weight of a vow. "You're not alone anymore, and neither am I." The farmhouse seemed to breathe with the night. Outside wind pressed against the wooden siding, slipping through gaps and rattling the shutters. The silence of Pine Hollow stretched deep, broken only by the occasional owl's call or the creak of timber shifting in the cold. For most people, it was peace. For David Miller, peace was never so simple. He sat upright in bed, sweat beading his brow despite the chill. His chest rose and fell with shallow breaths, each one forced through a tight throat. Sleep had eluded him again. Hours earlier, he had doused the lamp, drawn the quilt over himself, and closed his eyes. But his mind refused the stillness. Darkness was a doorway, and behind that door lay memory. It began as it always did, with the echo of gunfire. One moment David lay in the farmhouse, the next he was somewhere else. Heat pressing down, dust thick in the air, the world shaking with distant explosions. He could smell cordite iron and blood. Voices rose and fell around him, some shouting orders, others screaming in pain. His hands trembled as if holding a rifle again, though no weight rested there. His ears rang with the thunder of artillery, the sky fractured by smoke. He was back in that place, the place that lived beneath his skin. He remembered the flash that had thrown him into the dirt, the sensation of soil and blood filling his mouth, the deafening silence afterward. That was worse than noise. He remembered crawling toward a fallen comrade, fingers slick with mud and red. He remembered calling a name that never answered back. In the farmhouse bed, his body responded as if it were real. His pulse pounded, sweat dripped, his muscles tensed. His chest seized, dragging in air that felt too thin. David lurched upright, grasping at the quilt as though it were shrapnel. His breath tore out in ragged bursts, loud in the dark. His eyes darted across the room, seeking threats where there were none. The shadows lengthened into figures. A chair by the wall became a crouched enemy. The wardrobe loomed like a tank. He pressed his palms against his eyes, but behind the lids burned the images. Still faces pale with dust, eyes vacant, the silence of the dead. A sob clawed at his throat. He bit it back, jaw clenched, but his body trembled. He hated the helplessness, most of all, the way the past stripped him bare. He had survived the war, yet the war hadn't released him. It lived here in the marrow of his nights. A soft sound broke through the storm in his head, the shuffle of small paws. From the rug near the stove, Leo lifted his head, ears pricked. Mira stirred beside him, blinking in the dim glow of moonlight through the curtains. At first they only watched, sensing the shift in the air, the frantic breath of their human, the trembling that made the bed creak. Then, as if sharing a single thought, they rose. Mira padded to the bedside first, her amber eyes glinting. Without hesitation, she leapt lightly onto the mattress and pressed her body against David's side. Her warmth seeped through the thin fabric of his shirt, grounding him. Leo scrambled up a moment later, less graceful but just as determined. He nosed into David's lap, nudging his hand insistently. When David didn't respond, Leo licked his trembling fingers slow and deliberate, as though each touch carried a message. Here. Now. With us. David gasped at the contact. His eyes flew open, and for a moment the ghosts wavered. Instead of smoke and blood, he saw Mira's steady gaze. Her body curved close as if to shield him. Instead of silence, he heard the wet sound of Leo's tongue and the faint huff of his eager breath. Their bodies pressed against him, warm, alive, real. He could feel Mira's heartbeat where her chest touched his arm. He could feel Leo's tail thumping against the quilt, stubbornly cheerful, even in the dark. He clutched at them first unconsciously, then deliberately pulling them closer. His breath slowed by increments, drawn into rhythm with theirs. Inhale, exhale. Faster at first, then gradually steady, as if their lungs lent him a pattern to follow. The battlefield dissolved, piece by piece, carried away on the tide of their presence. The chair was just a chair. The wardrobe was only wood. The silence was not death, but night. Minutes stretched, measured only by the rise and fall of three bodies sharing the same fragile piece. David's trembling eased. The damp quilt cooled against his skin. He pressed his face into Mira's fur, inhaling her scent earthy faintly of hay and soap. It was not cordite. It was not blood. It was life. Leo gave a soft whine, almost a question. David stroked his head fingers, tracing the velvety ears as the ridge of his skull. "I'm here," he whispered hoarsely. "I'm here, buddy. Both of you. Thank you." The words broke something open inside him, not pain, but release. He had faced nights alone for so long, wrestling memories in silence. Yet here in the farmhouse that once felt empty, he was no longer alone. Two small creatures had seen him unravel and had answered not with fear, but with closeness. When his heartbeat settled, David leaned back against the headboard, both pups nestled against him. He gazed at the ceiling beams, the play of moonlight across the wood. The night remained still, yet it no longer threatened. His thoughts wandered not to the war, but to what survival meant. He had believed strength was measured in how well one carried scars, in how tightly one locked away the past. But as Mira breathed against his side, as Leo sighed contentedly in his lap, he realized strength could also mean surrender, allowing others to bear the weight, even if only by being there. He had rescued them from hunger and neglect. Tonight they had rescued him from memory's grip. Sleep did not come immediately, but rest did. He no longer thrashed beneath the quilt, no longer choked on ghostly air. His mind settled into softer currents, carried by the sound of steady canine breath. Mira shifted, once pressing closer, as though to remind him she would not move until he was safe. Leo's paws twitched in dream. But even asleep, he kept one against David's thigh, a small anchor refusing to let go. David closed his eyes not to hide, but to rest. The images of war still lurked at the edges, but they no longer ruled. Between him and them stood two guardians, silent yet unyielding. For the first time in years, David felt the night offer not only memory, but mercy. When dawn's pale light crept across the floorboards, David stirred with the pups still pressed against him. His body ached less than usual, his mind clearer. The shadows had not vanished entirely, but something had shifted. He stroked Mira's fur as she blinked awake, her gaze calm and knowing. Leo yawned loudly, tongue curling before bounding to the edge of the bed, ready for the day. David sat up slowly. His chest felt lighter. The farmhouse seemed less empty, the silence less oppressive. He realized then what had changed. For the first time, he had not faced the night alone. Standing at the window, David watched the morning unfold, frost glistening on the fields, smoke rising from a neighboring chimney, the promise of ordinary hours ahead. Mira leaned against his leg, Leo pawing impatiently at the floor. He smiled faintly, a smile that surprised even him. "All right," he said softly. "Let's face the day." The words carried weight beyond the moment. He was no longer speaking only of the morning chores or the feed runs or the endless work of farm life. He was speaking of the nights too, those silent battles. He would face them not alone, but with the steady breath of companions who had chosen him as surely as he had chosen them. And for the first time in a long time, that felt like enough. The rain had begun in the early hours, a faint patter on the roof that soon built into a relentless drumming. By midday, the sky had dissolved into one unbroken sheet of gray, the world outside blurred by water. The farmhouse groaned under the storm's weight. Wind pushed through the trees with moaning voices, and rivulets streamed across the window panes like veins of silver. Inside, David sat by the wood stove, the pups curled at his feet. Leo sprawled belly-up paws, twitching in half-dreams, while Mira rested her chin on her front legs, ears occasionally flicking at the howl of the wind. The fire's glow kept the room warm, but the storm pressed against the walls like an uninvited guest. David had grown used to such weather. Pine Hollow often wore storms like cloaks, sometimes heavy with snow, sometimes with rain. But something about today's downpour felt different. Maybe it was the unease that clung to the air, or maybe it was just his own nerves. He couldn't tell. It came suddenly, a pounding on the front door, sharp even against the roar of rain. Leo barked before David rose, a high, insistent sound that echoed through the cabin. Mira lifted her head, silent but alert, her amber eyes focused on the door. David pulled on his jacket and opened it. There stood Mr. Harris, the neighbor from down the lane, his raincoat plastered to his frame, his hat dripping water. His face, usually calm, was tight with worry. "David," he said over the storm, "we've got a problem." David motioned him inside quickly. Mr. Harris shook off the rainwater pooling on the entry mat and pulled back his hood. His gray hair was damp, his eyes urgent. "It's Anna," he said. "She's gone missing." David frowned. He knew Mrs. Anna Whitmore, everyone in Pine Hollow did. She was 78, a small woman with silver hair always tied in a bun, her back slightly bent but her spirit unbroken. She lived in a cabin near the edge of the forest, alone since her husband passed. Despite her age, she was fiercely independent, often seen walking with her cane and basket foraging herbs and mushrooms, or tending her garden. "Missing?" David asked. Mr. Harris nodded grimly. "Her niece came by this morning and couldn't find her. The bed hasn't been slept in, and the door was left ajar. The sheriff's office is searching, but the rain's washing away tracks faster than they can look. They've asked the neighbors to stay alert. I thought you should know." David felt the weight of the words settle in his chest. The forest was no place for an elderly woman during a storm like this. Paths became rivers mud, swallowed boots, and visibility dropped to almost nothing. Any sign at all, David pressed. Not yet. The deputies are combing the main trails. But Anna knows those woods better than most. If she wandered off track... Harris trailed off, shaking his head. The silence stretched. The fire crackled. Mira shifted closer to David, and Leo stood tail rigid, as though sensing the gravity of the moment. David glanced at them. Mira's gaze flicked between him and Harris, sharp and steady. Leo paced a short circle, ears perked, letting out a low whine. "They know something's wrong?" Harris said softly, surprised. David nodded. He wasn't sure when he had started trusting the pup's instincts, but tonight he didn't doubt them. They do. A thought formed in his mind, hesitant but insistent. He looked at Harris. Do the deputies have anything of hers? Something she wore, something with her scent. Harris blinked. Her niece brought a scarf. Why? David's eyes dropped to Mira and Leo. Mira had already risen, waiting as though she knew. Leo's tail beat once against the wall. They might be able to help, David said quietly. Minutes later, Harris returned with a small bundle wrapped in plastic to keep it dry. Inside lay a faded wool scarf patterned with tiny blue flowers. It smelled faintly of lavender and smoke, a trace of Anna in its threads. David crouched, pulling the pups close. He let them sniff the scarf carefully. Leo shoved his nose against it eagerly, inhaling with little snorts, while Mira leaned in slowly, studying the scent with deliberate focus. Their reactions were immediate: ears, pricked bodies tensing with intent. "They understand," Harris whispered, astonished. David stroked their heads. "Find her," he murmured, unsure whether he spoke more to himself or to them. Mira's eyes flicked up at him, steady, almost human in their clarity. Leo barked once, sharp and eager. David rose, pulling on his boots and grabbing his flashlight. "We're going," he said simply. Harris hesitated. "The rain, I know," David cut him off gently but firmly. "But if she's out there, every hour counts." The storm raged as they stepped onto the porch. The pups bounded ahead into the wet night, unfazed by the rain that soaked through their fur. David followed, his heart pounding with a mix of dread and determination. The woods loomed darker than usual, trees bent under sheets of rain. The ground squelched beneath each step, puddles reflecting broken beams of flashlight. David kept Mira and Leo close, calling their names against the storm's roar, though they seemed to need little direction. Leo darted forward, nose to the ground, zigzagging with energy. Mira moved slower, but her path was deliberate, head low, ears tuned to the forest. David realized they were working in tandem, Leo covering ground quickly, Mira ensuring they stayed on the right trail. Behind him, Harris puffed under the strain of keeping up. "You really think?" "Yes," David said without hesitation. "I've seen what they can do." And in his gut, he believed it. For a while, there was nothing but mud, rain, and the endless noise of the storm. Then Mira stopped, her body rigid. She sniffed at a patch of soaked leaves, then gave a sharp bark. David hurried over. Amid the debris lay something half buried, a broken walking stick splintered near the top. Recognition jolted through him. Her cane, Harris breathed. Mira pressed her nose to it, then lifted her head, eyes locked on the deeper woods. Leo whined, bouncing in place, eager to move. David gripped the flashlight tighter. She came this way. The forest thickened as they pressed on paths dissolving into streams. Branches whipped at their jackets, mud clung to their boots. The pups pushed ahead undeterred, their small bodies weaving through obstacles with purpose. David's mind raced. Why had Anna gone out here alone in weather like this? Had she been chasing something? Or had she simply lost her way? The storm gave no answers, only relentless water and wind. But every time doubt rose, the pups pressed forward as if guided by certainty. And for the first time that night, David felt a thread of hope pulling through the rain. The forest at night was never gentle, but under a pounding storm, it became something almost hostile. Rain fell like nails from the sky, clattering against leaves and branches, rushing in torrents across the mud. Every path that David knew was blurred, reshaped by water into temporary streams, and the air was thick with the smell of pine sap and wet earth. Yet through it all, two small figures pushed forward with certainty. Leo trotted several steps ahead, his nose skimming the ground, zigzagging across puddles and tangled roots, his tail stiff with focus. Mira, quieter and steadier, kept close to David's side. Her amber eyes flicked constantly between the trail and his face, as though reminding him that he wasn't alone, not tonight. Behind them, Mr. Harris struggled with the mud, his breath puffing in white bursts that immediately vanished in the damp air. His flashlight beam trembled with each step, scattering across trunks and brambles. David's own boots sank deep with every stride, but he pressed on. The scarf they'd found clung to his jacket pocket, a fragile piece of hope that the pups had turned into a guidepost. His military instincts kept his steps measured, his breathing steady, but inside his chest, his heart hammered with urgency. Anna Whitmore was out here somewhere, alone, in the rain, at 78 years old. Leo barked once, short and sharp, then pushed forward into a narrowing trail flanked by overgrown shrubs. He glanced back briefly, ears perked, before lowering his nose again. David called over the storm. "He's got something." Harris stumbled through the brush, coughing against the rain that streamed into his mouth. "Are you sure David didn't hesitate? Look at him." Leo's entire body moved with purpose, his paws, sure, his head darting from side to side, as if piecing together a puzzle only he could see. Mira mirrored his pace, though instead of darting, she walked like a shadow, ever watchful, ever present at David's knee. The deeper they went, the wilder the storm seemed. Trees groaned as the wind shoved against their trunks. Branches snapped overhead and fell into the mud. Water swirled around their ankles, icy enough to sting through boots. But Leo's determination never faltered. Every so often he barked once more, almost like a signal, then turned just enough for David to confirm he was on the right track before pushing forward again. As David followed, a memory slid unbidden into his mind. Nights on patrol overseas, trudging through flooded terrain with the sound of distant artillery instead of thunder. The weight of uncertainty pressing on his shoulders, the gnawing thought that every shadow might conceal danger. His chest tightened, his breath hitching against the memory. The forest blurred for a moment, the rain transforming into the hiss of static in his ears. But then Mira brushed against his leg. Not by accident. She leaned her warm body against him, firm enough that he felt the pressure through soaked fabric. He looked down, her gaze locked with his steady grounding. He exhaled long and controlled. The memory loosened its grip. He was not overseas. He was not on patrol. He was in Pine Hollow following two pups in search of a neighbor. And somehow that reminder steadied him more than anything else could. They came across broken branches hanging lower than they should, snapped at a height that matched where an elderly woman might push through with a cane. Mira sniffed at the wood, then nudged David's hand as though confirming it. "Signs," David muttered, crouching to examine the broken fibers. "She came this way." Harris looked around nervously. Why would she head deeper? The storm was already bad last night. Maybe she got turned around, David said. Or maybe she was trying to find shelter. As if on cue, Leo barked again, this time more insistent. He stood at the edge of a ravine, tail wagging in urgent jerks. David hurried forward, his flashlight beam cutting across the slope. The ground was treacherous mud sliding down toward a shallow stream that roared with newfound life from the storm. Yet near the water's edge, barely visible beneath tangled roots, lay a scrap of fabric clinging to a branch. David reached for it, tugged it free, and recognized the faded pattern of a house dress. "She's close," he said, his voice taut with adrenaline. Leo whined, pacing near the slope, then scrambled down halfway before sliding in mud. Mira barked once sharp, then followed carefully, testing each step before continuing. David and Harris exchanged a glance. Harris's eyes were wide, but he nodded. Together they followed the dogs down mud, sucking at their boots with each step. The ravine bottom was colder, the wind funneling through like a tunnel. The stream's rush filled their ears, and the rain was relentless. David swung his light across the shadows. And then there, a small figure slumped against the trunk of an old oak, half hidden by its gnarled roots. Soaked through, trembling violently, arms wrapped around herself in a futile attempt at warmth. Anna Harris shouted, stumbling forward. The woman lifted her head, weakly eyes blinking against the light. Her lips moved, but the words were lost in the storm. David was already moving. He dropped to his knees beside her, scanning quickly conscious shivering skin, pale but not lifeless. Relief surged through him. Before David could remove his jacket, Mira pressed herself against Anna's side. The pup curled tightly, sharing warmth with her small, sturdy body. Anna startled at first, then sagged into the contact, her trembling easing slightly. Leo circled twice, then sat in front of her, barking in short bursts, not frantic but rhythmic, almost measured. "He's signaling," Harris said in awe. David nodded. "He's telling us we've found her." The sight nearly undid him. 2 pups, once fragile and abandoned, now serving as guardians for someone in need. Mira's steady warmth, Leo's alert calls. They weren't just pets. They were lifelines. "Anna, can you hear me?" David asked, leaning close. Her lips trembled. "Cold," she whispered. "I know. You're safe now. We've got you." He stripped off his jacket and wrapped it around her frail shoulders. Harris added his scarf, tucking it gently beneath her chin. Mira stayed pressed against her, while Leo continued to bark softly, glancing back toward the slope, as if urging help to arrive. David knew time was critical. Hypothermia was a real threat. "We need to signal the deputies," he said. Harris fumbled for his phone, cursing. "No service down here." David exhaled sharply, then reached for the flare he kept in his pack, a habit carried over from years of always preparing for the worst. He struck it, and a red bloom of light flared against the storm, hissing as rain struck its burning tip. He held it high, waving it toward the ridge. Minutes stretched, each one heavy. David kept his arm around Anna, monitoring her, shivering. Mira never moved, her loyalty, unwavering, her little body a furnace against the woman's side. Leo paced and barked, then trotted a short distance up the slope before returning, unwilling to leave them, but desperate to hasten rescue. At last, distant shouts pierced the storm. Flashlights bobbed at the ridge, then figures began descending carefully into the ravine. "Sheriff's Department," a voice called. "Here," David roared back, holding the flare high. "We've got her." Deputies reached them quickly, raincoats plastered to their backs, boots sinking into the mud. One knelt beside Anna, checking her vitals, while another unrolled a thermal blanket. "She's alive," David said firmly, handing her over. "She needs warmth and fluids, but she's alive." The deputy looked up at him, gratitude etched across his face. "You did good, son." David shook his head. His gaze dropped to the pups. Mira still pressed against Anna until lifted gently away. Leo standing proud, chest puffed, as if he knew his barking had brought help faster. "They did good," David corrected quietly. With Anna secured between 2 deputies wrapped in blankets and steadied by strong arms, the group began the slow climb back up the ravine. Harris followed close, his face lined with relief. David brought up the rear, Mira trotting beside him, Leo bounding a few steps ahead before circling back. The storm had not lessened, but it no longer felt insurmountable. Every drop of rain was simply proof that Anna was alive, that the pups had done what no one else could. When they finally reached the waiting vehicles at the trailhead, paramedics ushered Anna inside. She looked up once, her frail hand reaching weakly toward David. "Thank you," she whispered. David shook his head again, gently guiding her hand instead toward Mira and Leo. "Thank them." Anna's fingers brushed against Mira's damp fur. The pup licked her hand softly, and for the first time that night, Anna smiled. The storm continued long into dawn, but the farmhouse was warm when David and the pups finally returned. Harris had gone with Anna to the hospital, promising updates. David dried the dogs carefully, rubbing their fur with towels until they shook free of the last droplets. Mira leaned into his hand, tired but content, while Leo sprawled across the rug tail, wagging even in exhaustion. David sank into the armchair, watching them. His heart was still racing, but in a different way now. "Heroes," he said softly, "both of you." Mira lifted her head, eyes meeting his steadily. Leo barked once, as if accepting the title. For the first time in a long while, David felt something bloom in his chest, not just relief, but pride. Not just survival, but purpose. The storm had finally passed, leaving Pine Hollow washed and glistening beneath a pale morning sun. Roads shimmered with puddles that mirrored the sky, rooftops dripped rhythmically, and the fields surrounding the town steamed faintly, as if sighing after a long ordeal. But the real talk of the town wasn't the storm, it was the rescue. By noon, news had already traveled from the sheriff's office, to the cafe from the cafe, to the post office from the post office, to every porch swing and diner booth in Pine Hollow. Mrs. Anna Whitmore had been found alive in the forest during the worst of the storm, and the unlikely saviors, two small half-grown pups, were now the beating heart of every conversation. David didn't expect anyone that morning. He thought he might have a quiet day with Leo and Mira, letting them sleep off their ordeal. But just after breakfast, a knock rattled his front door. When he opened it, there stood Mrs. Thompson from the bakery holding a box so large she could barely balance it. "Morning, David," she said, cheeks flushed from the brisk air. "Heard about what those two pups of yours did. Whole town did, actually. Thought they deserved a treat." She shoved the box into his arms before he could protest. Inside, nestled between layers of wax paper, were rows of small biscuits, bone-shaped golden, dusted with something sweet-smelling. "Dog cookies," she explained. "Baked them myself, honey oats, and just a hint of peanut butter. My late collie used to love them," David stammered, caught between gratitude and embarrassment. "That's thank you. You didn't have to." "Nonsense," she cut in, patting his arm. "Heroes deserve more than thanks. And from what I hear, those pups saved Anna's life. You keep feeding them right, Mr. Miller. They've got important work ahead." With that, she turned and bustled back down the porch steps, calling, "You give them one for me now." When David carried the box inside, Leo was already bouncing at his heels, nose twitching furiously. Mira sat quietly by the table, but her tail thumped once slow and steady, betraying her curiosity. David chuckled. Guess word really has gotten around. By afternoon, the trickle of visitors became a steady stream. Mr. Carter from the hardware store dropped off a bag of beef jerky. "Don't tell my wife it's the good kind." The Miller twins from school rode up on their bicycles with handmade cards scrawled in crayon. "Thank you, hero dogs." Old Mrs. Wilson brought a knitted blanket, muttering something about keeping those brave babies warm. Even Sheriff Donnelly stopped by hat in hand, a rare softness in his gruff voice. "You've got something special there, David. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Each visitor stayed only a little while, but their words left something behind, layering warmth inside the farmhouse, like logs steadily piled onto a fire. David had spent years in Pine Hollow, feeling like a shadow present, but unnoticed or at times quietly judged. He was the man who returned from service quieter than when he left. The man who kept mostly to himself. The man who seemed more comfortable in solitude than conversation. But now, when the townsfolk looked at him, their eyes didn't hold suspicion or pity. They held respect, gratitude, connection. And it startled him how much that mattered. 2 days later, David visited Anna at the county hospital. She was propped against pillows, her face pale, but her eyes lively again. A vase of wildflowers sat on the windowsill, the card beside it signed simply, "From Pine Hollow." When she saw him enter with Leo and Mira trotting obediently at his side, her whole face lit up. "My angels," she whispered, extending frail hands. "Oh, my beautiful angels." Leo leapt gently onto the edge of the bed, curling against her hip, while Mira nestled her head into Anna's palm. David stood quietly, hands in his pockets, watching the frail woman stroke the pups as tears slipped down her cheeks. "They kept me alive," she said softly. "That little one?" She nodded toward Mira. "She pressed herself against me all night. I swear I could feel her heartbeat, keeping mine steady." And the other, she looked at Leo. "He never stopped calling for help, did he?" David swallowed. "No. He made sure we found you." Anna turned her gaze toward him, then sharp despite her years. "And you, David. You didn't hesitate. You followed them when no one else could." He shifted, uncomfortable under her praise. I just trusted them. Sometimes Anna said, her voice both gentle and firm, trust is the bravest thing of all. The following weekend, Pine Hollow decided to do something it hadn't done in years: gather the entire town. The cafe owner organized it. The church offered the hall, and by Saturday afternoon, the place buzzed with chatter, laughter, and the smell of fresh-baked pies. Someone had even hung a banner across the entrance that read in bold red letters, "Thank you, little heroes." When David arrived with Leo and Mira, the room erupted in applause. Children rushed forward, first hands outstretched, eager to pet the dogs. Mira tolerated the attention with regal calm, leaning gently into small palms. Leo bounded from one child to another, licking faces, wagging so hard his whole body wiggled. Adults followed, offering handshakes to David, words of thanks, claps on the shoulder that rang with sincerity. For the first time in as long as he could remember, David didn't feel out of place in a crowd. He felt welcome. Tables were piled high with offerings, bags of kibble, homemade dog treats, collars with tiny brass nameplates. Even a hand-carved wooden plaque that read, Leo and Mira, Heroes of Pine Hollow. Never seen anything like it, Harris said, appearing at David's side with a mug of cider. Half this town never agreed on anything before. Now look at them coming together for 2 pups. David glanced at the gifts, at the smiling faces, at the pups basking in affection. Something loosened in his chest, a knot he hadn't realized he'd been carrying. It's not just about the dogs, Harris added more quietly. It's about you too. People see you differently now. David shook his head slightly. They shouldn't. It was the pups who saved her. Maybe so, Harris said. But you're the one raising them. You're the one giving them a chance to become what they were meant to be. Folks noticed that. Later that evening, as the celebration wound down, David found himself on the porch outside the hall. The cool night air, a welcome relief from the crowded warmth inside. Mrs. Green, the town librarian, joined him. She was a woman of quiet wisdom, her hair silver, her eyes sharp behind thin glasses. She'd always greeted him kindly, though their conversations had never gone beyond polite nods. Now she stood beside him, hands folded around a teacup, watching Leo chase moths beneath the lamplight, while Mira sat patiently at David's feet. They're remarkable, she said softly. David nodded. They saved Anna. That's all that matters. Mrs. Green glanced at him, a small smile tugging her lips. They saved more than Anna. David frowned. What do you mean they've saved you too, David? Her voice was gentle, but the words struck deep. For years you've carried yourself like a man lost. Not lost in place, but in spirit. As if part of you never came back from the war. He stiffened, but she continued. Now when I look at you, I see light in your eyes again. I see a man walking among his neighbors, not apart from them. Those dogs didn't just bring Anna home. They're bringing you home too. David swallowed hard, unable to answer. Mrs. Green reached out, resting a hand briefly on his arm. Let them keep saving you. Let us keep saving you. With that, she slipped back inside, leaving David staring after her, his heart heavier and lighter all at once. That night, back at the farmhouse, David sat on the rug with Leo curled in his lap and Mira pressed against his side. The gifts from the townsfolk were piled near the kitchen, a visible reminder that he and the pups weren't as alone as he once thought. He thought of Mrs. Green's words. They're bringing you home too. For the first time, he allowed himself to believe it might be true. That the bond he shared with Leo and Mira wasn't just healing them, it was healing him. That maybe, just maybe, Pine Hollow could become more than the place he lived. It could become the place he belonged. He stroked the pup's fur, listening to their steady breathing. Little heroes, he whispered. Maybe bigger than I'll ever be. Mira lifted her head, eyes locking with his in that quiet, grounding way of hers. Leo barked once, as if to say, "We're just getting started." David smiled, a genuine, unguarded smile that reached all the way to his eyes. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like a man carrying the weight of loneliness. He felt like part of something larger. The first snow of winter drifted gently over Pine Hollow, softening rooftops, blanketing the fields, and painting the town square in a hushed silver glow. The annual Veterans Festival, organized faithfully each year by old Mr. Carter, seemed more radiant than ever against the white. Strings of lights glimmered between lampposts. The air was alive with the scent of roasted chestnuts, and children's laughter rang like bells as they chased one another through the drifts. David hadn't planned to attend. Crowds still made him uneasy, and the memories of parades from his service days carried their own ghosts. Yet this year was different. This year, Leo and Mira trotted at his heels, two small, sturdy companions whose presence steadied him more than he could have admitted aloud. As they entered the square, heads turned. Murmurs rippled outward, not of pity, not of suspicion, but of recognition. The man with the pups. The man who, through them, had helped bring Anna home. David felt the weight of their eyes. But instead of shrinking beneath it, he held his shoulders a little straighter. The festival began with music from the town band, their brass instruments puffing clouds of breath into the frozen air. Veterans young and old lined the stage, medals gleaming against coats. Mr. Carter, tall and wiry despite his age, spoke with steady pride of honor, of service, of remembrance. Then, unexpectedly, his gaze found David in the crowd. "Tonight, Mr. Carter," Mr. Carter said, voice carrying clear, "we are reminded not only of those who once served, but of those who remind us what courage looks like here now. David Miller, would you join us?" A hush swept over the crowd as David froze, every instinct urging him to decline. But Leo nudged, his leg tail flicking, and Mira gazed up at him with calm insistence. Drawing a slow breath, David stepped forward, boots crunching in the snow. He reached the stage, the pups pressing close to his sides. Faces stretched out before him, expectant but kind. His throat tightened, but when he looked down at Leo and Mira, the words found their path. "I've been called many things in my life," he began, voice rough but steady. "A soldier, a veteran, a loner. Some thought I saved these two dogs when I brought them home from the shelter." He paused, glancing at the pups. Mira leaned against his leg. Leo sat proudly upright, though snowflakes clung to his ears. "The truth," David continued, "is that they saved me. I thought I was giving them a chance, but they gave me mine. They reminded me that trust, loyalty, and love can rebuild a man who thought he was broken beyond repair." Silence stretched heavy and full before the crowd erupted into applause, genuine, thunderous, echoing through the frosted night. David swallowed hard, emotion pressing hot against his eyes. He hadn't expected release in speaking aloud what he'd carried quietly for so long. Yet here among neighbors, it felt like shedding a burden. As the clapping softened, David looked again at Leo and Mira. Snow was falling more heavily now, dusting their fur, settling on their muzzles like delicate crowns. They stayed pressed close to him, small bodies radiating warmth into the cold evening. Kneeling, David laid a hand on each of them. The words came not for the crowd, but for the only ones who needed to hear them. "We'll never leave each other," he whispered. "Wherever life takes us, we'll go together. That's my promise." Mira's eyes shone with quiet understanding. Leo gave a sharp bark tail, thumping against the snow. Around them, Pine Hollow's townsfolk smiled, some brushing tears from their cheeks, as though they too had heard the vow. The festival went on with music, dancing, and laughter. But for David, the night had already given him what he needed most. Beneath falling snow, among the faces of his community, He had spoken the truth that had lived in his heart, not just that Leo and Mira were heroes. Not just that they had saved Anna, but that they had saved him, and in doing so, had given him back to Pine Hollow. The three of them stood together in the snow, a man and two small heroes, no longer alone, no longer adrift. And as the night deepened and the snow kept falling, their promise bound them tighter than any chain of war or solitude ever could. They were at last home.